Hi, welcome to the Trauma Thrivers podcast. Delighted to have you with us. I'm Lula Bentz, your host, a psychotherapist, a trauma expert, and a survivor myself. Lovely to have you with us. The Trauma Thrivers podcast is for anybody who has been through any sort of developmental trauma or who has complex PTSD. This podcast aims to help educate, inspire, and support those of us that are on a trauma healing journey. We've got stories, steps, and various solutions to trauma to help you heal. If you'd like more information or tips or tools or strategies, please go to traumathrivers.com. You can also find this podcast on my YouTube channel, Lula Bentz Trauma Thrivers. If you'd like to join our community of thrivers, please find us on Facebook under Trauma Thrivers. Andy, lovely to see you, and thank you so much for joining us today. I'm really delighted that you wanted to do a podcast, especially because I resonate so much with your story. And we've known each other for a while. So I already know quite a lot about you and think that you will inspire and help so many listeners. And
thank you, Lou. Bless you.
Really, really. So I suppose the first question is going to be, could you tell us a little bit more about your story?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Lou. And thanks for the opportunity to talk about it. I think the first thing to say is, I feel very comfortable now talking about my journey and what I went through. And that wasn't the case for a long, long time. So for anyone who is new or is very early on their journey of recovery from trauma, from abuse, or from addiction for that matter, which is all of my journey kind of wrapped up into one.
Yeah.
It's very different now to what it used to be. There's been a lot of healing over the years. And I've needed the time. I've needed the space and the time to heal. The kind of the guts of my story is between the ages of 8 and 10, I was groomed and sexually abused by a group of paedophiles in my hometown of Weston-super-Mare. And, it was horrific. It happened all of a sudden. There was no kind of slow build-up. The paedophiles weren't linked to church or to school, or they were literally a group of strangers. And I won't go into the kind of, the gratuity of it because I'm very conscious. I don't want to trigger anyone. Yeah. So I'm going to talk in general terms.
Okay.
We all understand what abuse is. We know what a sexual abuse is. We know what that means, Yeah,
sadly we do.
Yeah, no, indeed. The commonality between us is incredible. That's one of my main experiences, that I really now know that I'm not alone. And that is actually a huge factor of my healing. Yeah. One of the main consequences of the abuse was I felt so incredibly isolated and scared and deeply ashamed of myself, terrified that I would be judged if anyone could possibly find out about it. And I blame myself. I held myself completely responsible for everything that had happened. And even though as an adult, looking back, I could see after a lot of therapy that I couldn't possibly be responsible because I was a child and these were adults forcing themselves upon me. It took years to release the agony, the crippling shame that I felt around my role and what I did. The fact that a lot of my initial memories were around me trying to find these men and looking for them on my bike and And, but in a nutshell, I used to play a lot of football and cricket in a park around the corner from home. And there were a number of public conveniences, public toilets in and around the area. And after a game, I went to the loo and suddenly there were two men standing either side of me. And they were very complimentary about what a great footballer I was and I would be a professional one day. And they started to be very charming, but it just felt horrible. It felt very unnatural. Yeah. It felt very menacing. And the physicality of the men and everything else. I'm not going to go further into that detail. I don't want to trigger people. But it happened very fast. They suddenly turned from being very charming to being very coercive and aggressive. and basically made out as if I was lying to them and I was hurting their feelings, and they'd gone out of their way to support me playing football, and now I was saying I didn't want to know them, and it was suddenly very, very menacing, and I could feel, I just felt terrified.
Yes.
And the abuse started, and they were laying on very thick that I'd hurt them, and this is why their friend was in pain, and blah blah blah. And I was left in no doubt that I'd done some awful, awful crime, which was never specified. But you know, I was 8 years old, and you know, I was I don't know 4'8" or whatever, and they're 5'10", 6 foot, and just you know, and that was the beginning of 18 months, 2 years of sexual abuse in and around, well, in public toilets, in the parks, and on the seafront of my hometown, and it would maybe 2-3 times a week, and it was very controlled. They would make it very clear what the so-called rules of engagement were, the way that I needed to behave.
Yeah.
I mean, it was so controlling that I was never the first one to walk into the toilet.
Right.
I had to get there early at a specified time, and I had to sit on a bench or, you know, pretend my bike chain was broken about 50 yards away. And I was only allowed to walk in when they were already there. So I was never allowed to acknowledge them outside or you know, nod at them, or, you know, it was very controlled.
Right.
And there were almost always 3 of them, never less than 2, because as one would be abusing me, or I would be whatever with him, another one would be looked at, but then they would rotate round.
Yeah.
And you know, and it's just very confined. And so to cut a long story short, you know, I just went, after a while, to cope with it, I would minimize it, and I would just go along with it because I didn't know what else to do. Through the grooming, they made out they knew my head teacher, and they made out they knew who my father was. None of this was true. It was a means to shut me down. Yeah. And it meant that there wasn't anyone I could turn to say, I'm really scared, there's something happening. Yeah. I even remember them following me home on one occasion. And it was almost like there was nowhere I could go to get away from this. Yeah. It was that kind of controlling and menacing. And in the end, I just went along with it. I did everything they said in the end because I was desperate to finish. And there was always that lurking, horrible feeling that this could get worse. I didn't go along with it. Yes. And the challenge, Lou, I found once I started to talk about this, when I was in my early 20s, was that my first memories of the abuse were me going along with it. It was me on the bike riding up the seafront to the next toilet. Yeah. It was a chap coming into a latrine, and I'm standing there, and he says, "Are you Andy?" And I don't know him at all. And I go, "Yes." And we walk into a cubicle, and the abuse takes place. I've always said to friends that if the memories, when they came back to me, were not in chronological order, had they been, I would have more readily understood that I really wasn't responsible for what happened. I carried that shame and guilt for years, which meant it crippled me in terms of communicating with people. I was living a lie. I hated me, and so I was terrified of the world around me. And intellectually, and this is one of the key things of my healing, intellectually, I knew that a male, or a female for that matter, abusing a child was wrong. So what I did, I wasn't my fault. But emotionally, so many of these emotions were trapped in these suppressed memories that I didn't feel that I was innocent. I felt I was guilty. And their grooming and coercion and threats kind of really kind of convinced me of that in many ways. So it's really strange to say, but I forgave the men who abused me when I was in my early 30s. Right. And I never thought I would do that. I'll probably go into the detail of that in a little while. But I forgave me a decade later. Right. And I know it sounds bizarre, but it was almost as if, actually looking back, I needed to remove somehow the rage I felt towards them. And I would act out in a fantasy in my head. I would imagine in my darkness, hunting them down and finding them and torturing them and blah, and it was the only moment of power, albeit a very sick moment of power, I felt about the whole thing. But I also knew that this was hurting me and it wasn't hurting them. And I knew that I needed to let go of this rage because, they're oblivious to this. I have no idea who these men are. As I said, they're not linked to church or school or anything. And I got into my early 30s, and I'd been searching spiritually for years for a greater sense of peace, if you like, really, going to ashrams and healing centers and meditation groups and so forth. And I was in a healing center in Brazil, and during a guided meditation, they were leading us through this meditation. So you were invited to visualize people you loved and imagine them being at peace. And, from the heart, you were, sending them your love. And then they say, people you have a disagreement with or an argument with, please visualize them at peace and healthy and from your heart. And then people you got anger towards. And then the final stage was people you hate, and it just felt the moment. It just felt, this is the moment. I've got to get rid of this. I've got to let this go. Yeah. And I visualized or brought to memory as much as I could remember about them, because some of the memories are fragmented. Other memories were very full, if you like. And I just thought, I'm doing this for me, actually. I'm not doing this for them. I'm doing this for my healing. Forgiveness is about my healing. It's got damn all to do with them, And I visualized them and as best I could and just thought, what, I just want to let this go. I want to let this go. I want to focus all of this rage, all of this anger, all of this energy onto me, for me to move forward. And I know I sound a bit over the top, but I really felt a shift take place. Yeah. It was like I was now giving myself permission to move forward. Yeah. And the resentments, the rage has never come back towards them. And that was well over 15 years ago now, but I couldn't have done it a day before. I couldn't have.
No, things seem to happen at the right time, don't they? At the right space for us. And I suppose I'm interested just to kind of go back to what led you in your 20s to be able to find help in the first place. I mean, how did you come out of that teenage shame and that childhood horror to find the voice initially, to even realize that you needed help, and who did you go to?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Thank you. When the abuse finished, it was horrific. They threatened to kill me. It was very graphic. And I just buried it completely. And for all intents and purposes, it never happened until I reached puberty. And then these horrific triggers took place in my life. And I would see a girl I fancied and feel tremendous shame, feel out of my depth, feel I was drowning. And I'd already found alcohol, at a young age. I don't come from a family of heavy drinkers, but I found a drink and I loved the effect. And so my coping mechanism was to get drunk, because I felt power, I felt a rocket fuel within me for a while. That didn't last, but whilst it did, I thought I found the answer. This is it. Thank God for the drink, But come the age of 15, 16, the alcohol has stopped working. And all the underneath, all these emotions which have been suppressed were now just overwhelming me. And I kind of started self-harming. And, I don't remember the film, the De Niro film, Taxi Driver, and he's in the mirror and he's kind of shouting himself. And I took it to the next stage. I would have a drink in one hand and would punch myself in the other hand. I'm really getting, and just this crazy psychotic self-hatred and self-loathing was going on. Yeah. And in many ways, the alcoholism accelerated my emotional and psychological rock bottom. And come the age of 20, I was in a terrible place psychologically. I mean, I was having blackouts on a regular basis. I was having flashbacks to the abuse. I had post-traumatic stress disorder, but I'd yet to have a diagnosis. So I had all the symptoms of PTSD. And I was broken, and there was no pretense about that. My family could see that I was in a terrible place. And after I got kicked out of university because of my alcoholism, I was sent to an amazing psychologist who was semi-retired. And he had a lot of experience with childhood sexual abuse and with addiction.
Wow.
And he was the right person for me at the right time. And he helped me recognize that I was an alcoholic first and foremost. And I needed to get sober before I started to deal with it. So I needed to take away the alcohol, not least because I was just, my life was so chaotic. I couldn't possibly say or talk about what was happening. So he helped me get sober and he guided me to AA. And thank God he did that. I've been in AA now 28 years, just gone actually, 28 years sober. So I have a lot to be grateful to this amazing psychologist and to AA as well.
Amazing.
But then he helped me with what we now call mindfulness techniques.
Okay.
So I would turn up at his place on a Saturday morning usually, and I would be in bits. I would be, flashback, having a panic attack, and we would go into his garden, and he would help me, or he encouraged me to focus on the trees and on the physical world outside of me, as opposed to, he would call it, the mental universe that you're trapped in. Yes. And so these mindfulness techniques, for me, focusing on a tree and describing it to him, and it took me ages even to do that, because the fear was, what happens after that? It's like an abuse. This is going to get worse. Well, it was like everything was like questioned. Everything was, lack of trust. But over a period of several months, these mindfulness techniques really helped me start to get more present. Right. And that enabled me to talk about what I could then remember about the abuse.
Okay.
Which it was just so overwhelming at the beginning.
Yeah.
But the support of like going to AA, and actually in AA, for a long time, I really thought I was the only one. But in AA, I met a number of other trauma survivors, people who've also been sexually abused as children and as adults, for that matter, who were somehow stay sober, stay clean, addicts as well. So the one isn't all addiction. And that encouraged me. That made me realize that there were people further down the road of healing who could identify with how I felt, with the self-loathing, the self-hatred, and the self-harming. I mean, even after I put down a drink, I still puncture myself sometimes and just kind of losing it.
Yeah.
But so this amazing psychologist who passed away over a decade ago, I went to see him for about 15 months or so.
Okay.
And over that course of time, I shared with him and we processed everything that I could then remember about the abuse.
Yeah.
But I could only remember probably 40% then.
Yeah.
A lot of the deeper stuff was buried and took years to gradually kind of come up.
And then what did you do after him? What was the kind of path to healing for you? Because I know that, like me, we're great advocates, I think both of us, saying there isn't one way, there isn't one path, but also that path isn't necessarily over in a matter of months or even years. It's a gradual process, isn't it, really?
Yeah. I think I needed to have contact with people. I need to have a support group around me of fellow survivors who are that little bit further down the track than me, because I found it very easy to go back into denial about the abuse and pretend I never pretended it didn't happen, but I could say to myself, I dealt with it now. It's okay. But actually in my behavior, I had issues around intimacy. I found out at my depth when it came to dating. I really felt like I was a 10-year-old when actually I was 23, trying to go on a date and so it helped me to keep around people who would encourage me to talk about how I felt and to do that in a safe, healing environment. And for me, it was regular AA meetings and a number of other friends within AA who were also survivors, male and female for that matter. Yeah. And I think the acceptance, I misunderstood, rather like forgiveness, I misunderstood what acceptance was. In my head, when you accepted something, it meant you were almost like a nirvana-like state of everything's okay now, I've accepted it. Whereas actually, it's not. I accepted the abuse in the context that I wasn't pretending it didn't happen. I was no longer diminishing the effect it had on my life. Yeah. It was kind of, it is what it is, which kind of enabled me then to maintain the support that I needed moving forward. So that underlying support of fellow survivors has always been there for me to tap into.
Amazing.
And I've needed to on a regular basis.
Yeah.
And I think it's important to say for anyone who might be new on the journey, that support can be just going to see a film with a mate.
Yeah.
And just hanging out. It's not talking about all the heavy stuff all the time and it certainly isn't now. I mean, it really is the bond I feel with fellow survivors is the deepest and most profound I have in my life. Yeah. And I love these people. I mean, just beautiful souls. And so it is really a journey of healing and a journey of learning with people who understand, what I've been through, and I understand what they've been through. And it's that mutual bond, if you like, a kindness and a love and a compassion. So it's been tremendously informative, educational, but also inspirational as well.
Yes.
But the other things for me, I've always, rather like you, I think I've always been a searcher. I've always been looking and looking. And I've done despite the lack of hair, I've done the cliche things. I've been the hippie, and I've lived on ashrams in India and met various gurus and met a few fakes, but met a few very genuine ones as well, no question. Yeah. And that's been inspirational. Yeah. So it's kind of the support I've had and the foundation of recovery has given me the opportunity just to explore and to find, what's within me, what really interests me in life, what's authentic for me. Yeah. And that's hugely rewarding, actually. Yeah. And that started with the psychologist who we would call him a life coach now, albeit he was hugely qualified, but he guided me and helped me so much more than just dealing with the trauma. Yeah. So he would talk about meditation a lot. Right. He would talk about karma and past lives, not as a means to say you must follow this, but just to open my mind up to maybe this is something you'd like to explore. Yeah. And I'm so grateful that he did that. Because that's kind of part of my journey anyway. Yeah, to be honest with you.
Man. And then didn't you go on to do more trauma-focused therapy at some point as well? Or you met another lady, I know, therapist who was quite integral and important in your life?
Yes, indeed. I was 40 and I was going for a really tough period of my life. I'd had about 15, 20 years in professional theatre, running theatres and having a successful career. And I was doing big festivals with well-known names and loving it, enjoying it, but also being a workaholic sometimes as well. So I didn't drink, I didn't use, but I swerved into workaholism. And that was also about identity at times as well. And, so it hasn't been the straight path. It's been, as often it is, 3 steps forward and maybe 2 back. But thankfully, the 2 back has never lasted that long because of the support network of kind, good people who can just help me. It's just vital to have that for me. Yeah. But I was 40 and it's amazing how it is. I had what I thought and friends said to me was my dream job. Okay. And to the outside world, it was because of, I won't say where it was because of the privacy issue of it, but it was in an arena which I loved and had always loved. And it was a fantastic opportunity. But that job coincided with a lot of underlying suppressed memories coming up, which had never come up before. And these were overpowering. And the PTSD was, I was getting triggered on a regular basis. And the way the PTSD manifests in me is I would have flashbacks to the abuse. Sometimes they would be visual. I would have a memory of it. And I would feel it in the body, the tension, the anxiety, the stiff neck, the pain in the lower back, and nightmares and whatever. But at other times, I would just go to a place of shock and there will be no visual memory, but it's rather like, if anyone's had been in a car accident and that immediate reaction just after impact where you're in shock, it would be like that. And you would feel incredibly vulnerable and very exposed. And sometimes I would start to dissociate and feel as if my legs might give way. And it was a horrible feeling of vulnerability, And this was happening more and more often. Okay. And it's weird how these things pan out. At this place of work was an individual who really, reminded me of the main paedophile from years ago. His physicality, the way he looked, his eyes, and it brought everything up to the surface. And in many ways, it needed to. I needed to have a present day trigger, which was that powerful, if you like, in terms of the reaction I had to really bring up the deepest stuff. So in a weird way, although I didn't feel it at the time, I am grateful now. So I walked out the job, and within a week, I was sitting in a therapy session with a wonderful therapist, Sarah Passon-Briggs, who I've worked with since, actually. I mean, we worked together. She's been my therapist, but I worked with her professionally since as well. So it's been a tremendous relationship we've developed together. And she was exactly the person I needed for me at that stage in my journey, because it was so raw, but she just created this safe space in which I could get this stuff out. Yeah. One of my diversions, Lou, and I don't know if you've done this, but I would I sometimes, looking back, would sit with a counsellor and think they're not really ready to deal with my stuff. It's too much for them. It's too overwhelming. And, obviously that's my way of saying I'm not ready to talk about it, but I project it onto them. With Sarah, I just never had that sense with her. I sensed she had the broad shoulders and the experience. And it's kind of like, well, we're here now, so we've got to get on with it. Yeah. And that was when the deepest, most painful memories of being, of them threatening to kill me, of the very specific. I mean, I had a recurring flashback for years, and I'm not going to the gratuity of it because it might well trigger people. Yeah. But suffice to say, there was a man right there in my face, threatening to kill me, and various other things were happening, which were deeply threatening. And it was during my sessions with Sarah that the fullness of this memory came up. Okay. And I remembered so much more. And things started to fall into place at a deeper, profound level. And the enormous compassion I felt for the little Andy then, which I'd struggled to connect to before that point. Yeah. Intellectually, I had compassion, but emotionally, at some level, there were false beliefs within those suppressed memories which were affecting me and directing me in my attitude in life. Yeah. And working with Sarah, so many of these memories were now coming up with more information. Yes. And I could feel and remember what I thought. I mean, it was almost pristine. It was so raw and real to me. But that was the turning point, the massive healing in my life. Yeah. And I mean, during those 8 months with Sarah, there are times when I would leave her therapy session and feel so drained and exhausted. I thought, how the hell am I going to get home? Right. I avoided the underground for a number of months. Yeah. Because at times the rawness of the rage, I didn't trust myself just to go, F it. And,
And were you only with Sarah for 8 months?
8 months. It was 8 months initially.
Was it?
Because the process was I started to write loads of notes. Okay. Just to get the stuff out. And these notes were, so many memories came up with writing the notes. And what shocked me looking back, it shocked me at the time, was how many different locations I was abused. Yeah. There were at least 13 different locations, in public toilets and parks and the seafront, in someone's flat as well. One of the vaguest memories, which has never really developed more, is of being in a bed with an old-fashioned kind of, not stainless steel, raw iron kind of bed thing at the back with the holes going down. Yes. An old-fashioned, I don't know if it was cinefilm, but it was some kind of recording, very, we're talking about 1980, 81 at the latest there, actually. Yeah. And it's just vague, but it's there, and, it is what it is, So I started to write loads of notes. And as these notes developed more and more and more, I went back to see Sarah. Right. So I think we had 8, 9 months, and there was a gap of about 3. Yeah. And then I went back, I think it was for another maybe 4 or 5 months. Yeah. By which stage I'd written a book. I'd written a manuscript, which eventually became a book, know.
Have you got a copy of your book next to you?
I have. Oh,
good. because I think everybody should read it. Yeah.
Thank you, Lou. There's the book, A Small Boy Smiling. You see, the photograph for me, this was just before the abuse, and I was about 7, 8 years old in that photograph there.
Yeah.
And whenever I was a kid at a family party and the album would come out and people go, oh, look how cute you look there. That was a photograph that disgusted me. Yeah. I couldn't bear looking at it. I wanted to punch the fuck out of that little kid because of the rage and the blame I felt. Yeah. So when I decided on a cover, I deliberately chose this photograph because I love this little boy now.
Yes.
The integration and the healing I feel now is so profound. I feel such admiration for the little boy who survived.
What he got through. Yeah.
Exactly. He did everything he could to survive, and he did survive. I'm here now because of the amazing resilience of that little boy, and I see that in other survivors as well. I mean, it's amazing what we've been through, and to be here to be able to talk about it.
Listen, for anybody listening, who doesn't really know too much about trauma, I suppose what I want to kind of say at this point is we have 5 survival responses, and as children, very often, well, most of the time, we cannot fight and we can't flee. So that gives us no other alternatives to do one of the other 3, or the other 3, which is freeze, flop, which is or try and befriend.
Yeah, I did all of those.
Yes.
I did all of those, definitely.
You did those, or part of you did that to survive.
Yes, and that's what I remember now, Lou. And it took me to the age is irrelevant, but in my case, it took me to the age of 40 to get that. But that helped me let go of the crippling shame I felt, and the enormous healing. I mean, it's hard to put it into words, but I'm describing a lot of what I went through, but I'm not reacting to it physically, whereas I used to.
Yes.
I used to feel all the tension in the body. The flashbacks would have started by now. I can sometimes get emotional flashbacks, but they're not that kind of crippling nature that they used to be.
Yeah.
The difference I describe it now is that in the old days, I would be triggered and I'd relive the abuse in real time. Yeah. So my consciousness was 70-80% whatever aware of the abuse, and really very little about what was going around me, and I certainly couldn't cope with that. Whereas now I remember the abuse like any normal memory. It's like a memory on the screen of my mind. I'm not reliving it. What I'm actually feeling is tremendous compassion for the child. I can have physical anxiety at times, certainly. That's diminished, but it can still be there because it's still a traumatic experience I'm remembering. But I don't relive it, and that's probably that's a massive change in my journey for me.
And I know too, for me and both for survivors that I work with, that once we can become our own nurturing parent, and we can really heal that part of us that basically believes at some point in that child part that, not only were we to blame, but that we were dirty or disgusting or bad. Once those beliefs are turned around, that is the massive kind of final healing moment.
We can't fast forward this. I mean, I'm supporting a couple of people at the moment. And one of them is an extraordinary man, a lovely man. He's now, I think he's in his early 60s. And now he's talking about the issues that I was speaking about 8 years ago. Yeah. And it's starting, you can sense, I can see the journey from here to here.
Yes.
And he's developing an enormous compassion for the child, as opposed to blaming the child or damning the child. And these are such powerful emotions. Yes. And when they're suppressed, it's very difficult to articulate what the hell's going on. I was incredibly confused. Yeah. And I think that's why this ongoing support network, which are people I've invited into my life.
Okay.
No one's kind of nominated who they are. It's my choice.
Yes.
And I think that's what's really helped me get to where I am now. Yeah. So although I rejected that love at the beginning, didn't trust it, what these people are after, like what the hell's going on? As I started to accept that I was lovable, that I was worthy of having some respect and kindness and gentleness. That's what's grown within me as well. Yes. And I know it sounds really weird to say this, but it is what it is. I don't have any regrets about my journey. I know it couldn't have been any other way because it wasn't any other way.
Yeah.
In terms of my healing.
Yes.
And I just fundamentally accept what happened. All of the responsibility belongs to the men. That's their crap.
Yes.
It's nothing to do with me in a way.
No.
I just look after the child and honour that beautiful little boy.
Yeah. Is there anything that you would recommend to people perhaps not to do, or anything that didn't personally or that held you back, let's say, from healing?
Do you know, it's what held me back for many years. I couldn't cry.
Okay,
I couldn't cry. Yeah. I would the emotions would come up. I'll get to here and I'll shut them down, and then I'd be the workaholic or live in a fantasy world or whatever. And that manifested in various different ways, with difficulty with intimacy and love addiction, or this kind of thing, which a lot of us can ID with in here.
Or avoid.
So I needed to allow myself to cry. I was terrified of feeling the enormity of my rage, because I was many years ago, I remember 87 Hungerford, Michael Ryan went on the rampage and he killed loads of people. Now, I thank God I'm not a violent person, but whenever I was triggered and felt this rage, I would think of him. Now, I've no idea what made him do that awful, awful thing. But for a while, that stopped me from feeling the enormity of my rage, because I used to think to myself, what am I capable of? Who will I become? Yeah. Will there be some kind of character change in me whereby I'm able to do something horrific? And so I had to allow myself to feel the enormity of my rage without hurting me and without hurting anyone else.
Yeah.
And that support network, again, was vital in reminding me that at the core of me is a very gentle, kind man.
I would agree.
So I wouldn't have done something horrific, but I needed that to be reflected back to me from people who had been through the same stuff as me.
Yeah. And out of curiosity, do you feel that, because I have lots of people I work with who can't feel or don't feel or don't cry and find it really, really difficult to express their emotions, and I always wonder whether sometimes rage is the kind of, or anger is like the racket emotion at the top, and actually once you get underneath the anger, you get to all the things that really are going on beneath it, which is kind of the hurt and the pain and the shame and the sadness.
Yeah, and that's a game changer. Once you get to that level and the tears come, it is. I remember in this room I am now, 8 years ago, sitting here, and I was finally crying. This is when I was with Sarah, finally crying. And in the end, there weren't any more tears coming out of the ducts, but my whole body was expelling. It was still going for this. My stomach was like, it was going for this whole kind of almost like an ejection of this energy.
Yes.
And after that was exhaustion, and then came peace.
Yes.
And I went through that practice, or that, I would be on the, this is after I was back on the tube. I'll be in the tube and I could feel the emotion coming up. And I got to the stage then when I knew I was healing. And I thought, you know what, Anne? I don't give a damn if I lose it on this train and just cry. Because in 20 minutes, everyone else has forgotten about it. And I'll be at home. Who gives a toss,
Yes.
And it never happened quite that way. But I was allowing myself. If it did, it does. I waited for decades to heal. So let's not stop it now.
Yeah.
And I would get home and just pour out of me. And I just said to myself, this is healing. This is, at last, thank you. This is now healing. And that's been my experience, because 8 years on from that, I still feel so much more peaceful in my life. So, yeah, you're right. You've got the rage, the anger, and then the shame and everything else underneath. And it's when you start to cry, giving that little boy or that little girl that voice, allowing that child just, it's extraordinary.
And now what's beautiful for me is that you do have that voice, because you've got the book and you speak and you advocate for other survivors. And I know that we met on a 1 in 4 survivors video experience. So you're doing all of that. And what's next for you now? What do you want to go on to do?
Do you know, I never thought I would leave the theatre. I ran theatres, I did big festivals, whatnot, and really loved it and enjoyed it. I get more satisfaction out of doing this than I did out of that. And I didn't think that would ever happen. Yeah. There's nothing so special. I gave a talk in Inverness before lockdown, the first lockdown. And I was with Madeline, who who's a good friend of ours, Madeline Black, bless her.
Who's a great friend, yeah.
Indeed, an amazing, wonderful lady, very inspirational lady. And Madeline was on the platform, myself and 2 other remarkable people. And I shared my story, and then with what I said and with the various questions and answers coming back, a group of 300 or so people, absolutely everything was shared. I mean, including the detail, because they did ask me about, if I felt comfortable, could I explain a bit? I said, I do actually. And then I checked in with myself in the taxi, and I thought, all I feel is tired. I don't feel shame. No. I don't feel rage. Yeah. I don't feel like hurting myself, and I haven't done for years, I just feel tired. And I thought, my God, how far have I moved forward through this process? And I just feel incredibly fortunate, And so for me, moving forward now, I'm working on a second edition of the book,
right?
Which is more focused at early recovery from trauma.
Okay.
I mean, my journey was a teenage alcoholic, self-harmer. I got sober, thank God, at 20. I've been sober now 28 years. And so the book is focused more at maybe younger people, but I'm sure it still applies regardless of age. Trauma is trauma anyway. And I'm hoping that will give me a bit more of a platform to do more work in this sector. And I'm doing various work with different charities as well. So it's despite the pandemic, there's still some activity taking place.
Yes.
Not as much as I would like,
No. Well, I'm hoping. I mean, I know that you, me and Madeline and a few other people had our Day of Hope organised pre-COVID times where we were going to all get together and have an inspirational storytelling survivor.
We're going to do it. We're definitely going to do it, aren't we? There's no question it's there. Yeah.
Do you reckon 2021? What do you think?
I think so. Do you know, theatres are talking about opening. So the only concern people have is being in a big room together.
Yes.
And if theatres are going to open, then we can just follow their protocol. Okay. So I'm sure we can do it. And then offer the Zoom element for those who geographically or
can't make it.
Because this can bring us all together all over the world. There are so many people, regardless of the origin of the trauma. Trauma is trauma, isn't it, at the end of the day?
Exactly. And you and I both know about sexual trauma, but emotional, physical, neglect, attachment trauma, it's all trauma to the body.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
It doesn't matter what type. And, I'm sure some people will be listening to this, and I hope you don't mind me going, yeah, but what Andy has been through is just atrocious, and mine isn't anywhere near as bad as that. But I just want to say to people, it's not even about the level of trauma, is it?
Indeed. Yeah.
And we need to stop other trauma survivors going, well, mine in comparison to that isn't, so who am I?
It can be a convenient, with the greatest respect to people who think that, it can be a convenient diversion from dealing with their own trauma, because there's no pecking order here.
No.
They have every right to get the help that they need. I'm supporting a chap at the moment who was emotionally abused. There was no sexual abuse, and he fell into this trap.
Yes.
And we sat down and we compared our symptoms, and they were exactly the same. I said, where you describe a panic attack is exactly the same way as I describe a panic attack. When we about anxiety or flashbacks is exactly the same. So I don't look at other people's trauma and think, not at all.
No.
We all have a right to receive the healing. And I would encourage anyone to please, step forward and get the help that they need.
Yeah. And I know that on your website that you've got a resources page and you've got some numbers and all the rest of it, and organisations. And I have too on Trauma Thrivers. And if people want to see more of you or get hold of you, shall we send them to which website at the moment is best for them to find you on?
Matt Carey Books is the best website. That's got the links to the BBC Radio 4, the Untold programme I did, and the resources page. And also people can email me from there as well. So they're very welcome to if they'd like to. And any kind of guidance I can offer, I'll be very happy to do so.
Thanks, Andy. That's really lovely of you. And thank you for your time today.
Right, thank you.
For your incredible story, and for being a friend and a fellow on this journey. And I love the spiritual stories too. They're always great.
Yeah. Bless you, Lou. You do so much good work, the Trauma Thrivers group and all the other work you're doing. I mean, I know you. I know how much you do because, the September Day we spoke about last year, which didn't happen when we're all going to come together. You were absolutely the energy behind that. So we owe you a lot of gratitude, my love. So thank you.
Oh, pleasure. That's a pleasure. And I love it. And it's not like work, is it? It's a joy.
No. It's deeper than that, isn't it? It's right in there. Yeah.
So thank you for today. And thanks to everyone for listening.
Thank you.
And hopefully we'll catch up very soon.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for listening to today's podcast. I hope it helped you in some way. And I really hope to see you back here soon. If you have anything to share on today's experience or podcast, please nip over to the YouTube channel or the Facebook group Trauma Thrivers and let us know there.